So welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all the major podcast platforms. I'm Paul Smith, and I'm one of the hosts of Food Farm Talk. The other hosts are Emily Duncan and Abdul Rahim Abdullah. Today on Food Farm Talk, we're talking to Karen Ross of Farmers for Climate Solutions to find out about their proposals for programs to assist farmers in mitigating and adapting to climate change as part of the COVID kind of Build Back Better response. They've been lobbying the federal government and have had success getting words into the recent speech from the throne, which will lead to action, presumably. So please follow our podcast and our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts. We're broadcasting here from the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe Nation. Earlier this year, we had Katie Ward of the National Farmers Union and Brent Preston of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario on the show talking about Farmers for Climate Solutions, not long after they were launched on Agriculture Day in February 2020. So we're now happy to have Karen Ross on to talk more about the activities of Farmers for Climate Solutions. And Karen and I have worked on climate-related projects in the recent past here, and glad to see her getting some profile on this file. So I have Karen on Zoom here from Ottawa. So good morning, Karen.
Hi there, Paul.
Why don't we start with you briefly introducing yourself and a little bit about the organization and some of the members of the coalition.
Sure, Paul. Thanks for having me. So I'm Karen Ross, as you said, and I'm the director of Farmers for Climate Solutions. And as coming up to here, in terms of the work that I've done, I've been in food and agriculture related work for the past 10 years. I've always aspired to be a farmer myself. So, since my early 20s, I've been growing at a small scale on rented land. And I just want to start off with the best news of the summer for me is that my partner and I finally purchased our own farm up in Laurentian, so halfway between Ottawa and Montreal. And, we still grow at a relatively small scale, but to sell to farmers markets and some daycares in town.
Cool.
Yeah, work-wise also, beyond farming and growing food for communities, I have a PhD from Western University, so in your neck of the woods, Paul. So Farmers for Climate Solutions, Paul, way more exciting than myself, is the first of its kind national coalition of farmer-led and farmer-supporting organizations across Canada that know that agriculture can be part of our Canadian climate solution. So our ultimate objective as a coalition is to influence policies and practices that help farmers to reduce emissions, to build climate resilience, and improve their own livelihoods. As you said, we've been working together since February of this year. So we launched on National Agriculture Day, Paul. And we thought we had perfectly laid plans. We were looking towards the next climate plan in Canada and how agriculture could play a role within that. We were thinking about the negotiations around the next Canadian Agricultural Partnership. And then all of a sudden, the global public health pandemic hit in March, so just 1 month after we launched. And so what Farmers for Climate Solutions decided to do was present the government with a report with 5 priorities that summarizes what we think farmers and ranchers are looking for in Canada.
Thanks, Karen. So building on what you just said, you released that report, and that was back in August. So that sort of focused your lobbying efforts, as you just kind of explained, on the federal government. And the 5, so the first one is encourage on-farm renewable energy generation, fuel switching, and building retrofits on farm. So can you talk about a little bit more specifically about what you're proposing for each of those areas that you mentioned?
Yeah, for sure. So, Paul, green energy and green technology is going to be a big part of Canada's recovery. We've seen that already. We've already seen a major $10 billion investment from Infrastructure Canada announced, within the past week in large part for investments in green energy, so in renewable energy production. And what we're advocating for is that, farmers and ranchers shouldn't be left out of this picture. So farmers and ranchers are really well positioned to generate energy on their, given the challenge we face in terms of global climate change, we do need to urgently transition to lower GHG fuels. And given the fact that farmers have large land masses, they are well positioned to think about installing solar arrays, wind generation, biogas facilities for manure management with the right kinds of incentives. So, Paul, we do have some incentives that are offered at a federal level for the adoption of renewable energy. And a few provinces have currently offer programs. But what we realized in thinking through this priority is, we dug a little deeper to find out, is this program enough? Are farmers picking up renewable energy across Canada? And what we've learned is that only 4% of farms in Canada currently are generating renewable energy either to use on farm or to sell to the grid. And that only one farm since the announcement of the 2018 Canadian Agricultural Partnership has actually benefited from these programs. Wow. So what we think we need here, Paul, if we're really being serious about our climate commitments, what we really would love to see is an incentive program that isn't piecemeal across provinces, but encourages kind of widespread adoption of clean energy for farmers and ranchers. What we love about this recommendation, Paul, is that farmers, with the right incentives, if they are empowered to install these kinds of technologies, then not only can they save on, things like diesel fuel, high GHG fuels, so save on their own expenses, but into the future, hopefully they can also generate a revenue by selling this energy back to the grid. So, that's always helpful for a farmer's business. Maybe just quickly then, Paul, I'll talk about, battery-powered machinery. This is something that we're really interested in because what we know in Canada is that Canada actually has a competitive advantage when we compare it to other countries in terms of the production or the manufacturing of big batteries. So what I mean by big, that's maybe like the layman's way of saying it. I don't know how else to say it, but like electric batteries for buses and big trucks and things like tractors. We're actually pretty good at doing that. So again, this is a question of not leaving our sector out of the conversation because there's lots of, green technology conversations around getting those big batteries into, public transport systems and into our trucks that, carry goods across the country. There's far less to talking about getting that into our tractors. And for us, it is in the near future, it is within the next generation that we are going to have to be on cleaner fuels in our farm machinery. And why not benefit now to have made in Canada solutions that farmers can purchase? We don't want to have to be importing those from other countries. So again, that's less about an investment directly in farmers, but it's an investment that would benefit farmers into the future. We'd hope, of course, that there would be incentives and maybe even mandates to help farmers then adopt this clean technology on farms. Well, some of the coolest stories of farmers with electric tractors come out of Ontario, actually. We have one of our farmers in our networks has an electric tractor, and he gets, the same horsepower compared to his diesel tractor. He can go 5 to 8 hours on his electric tractor. So, he's getting what he needs and saving the money because he doesn't have to purchase.
Yeah. Okay, good. So again, going through your recommendations, the second one is to scale up agri-environmental incentives. So as you mentioned, there's already some existing ones under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership and so on. So what exactly would scaling up involve and cover?
Yeah, good question, Paul. So let me start off with a stat here. If we compare Canadian investments in environmental programs in agriculture to other countries like the EU and the US, what we realize is that Canada's scale of investment pales in comparison to these other ones that are providing almost 10 times more investments into farmers to improve their environmental performance. What we know, Paul, is that farmers and ranchers are stewards of our land. They want to be part of, providing public goods and services to Canadians, like clean air, clean water, great soil. The farmers within our network want to be part of Canada's climate solution. But farmers take a lot of risk in changing their practices, Paul. And so what we're looking for in terms of investments in agroecological incentives are programs that help to cost share the financial cost on farmers to adopt new practices. So I'll give you a good example. One of the on-farm practices that helps to reduce emissions and build resilience is cover cropping. And we see cover cropping adopted by many Canadian farmers, but it's still not adopted at a very large scale. In Iowa, they offer an interesting program where they were first subsidizing farmers $40 an acre for the adoption of cover crops. The program was so well subscribed that then they reduced the subsidy to $25 an acre. And what they found was very widespread adoption of cover cropping, which led to lots of environmental benefits, sigsignificant GHG reduction, increased carbon sequestration, more biodiversity, better water management, all the great things that we're looking for.
Yep.
And this is actually being piloted now in Ontario. So Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario is now starting an incentive program like this at a small scale. So Paul, what if we thought creatively about how these kinds of programs could scale up across the country so that across hundreds of thousands of acres in Canadian farmlands, we could see the adoption of practices like cover cropping that in the end support farmers, right? In the end, what we find with cover cropping is that it's actually a good practice for the farmers' bottom line, but it's those first few years where it poses an economic challenge. So what we're looking for really is that public incentive that helps bridge that gap to get the farmer to adopt that practice with confidence without kind of bearing the brunt of the major risk of adopting that practice. And then hopefully it becomes kind of a long-term adoption on the farm.
So your third one talks about investing in agro-environmental agrology services, especially through farmer-to-farmer training, demonstrations, and mentorship. So can you talk a bit about what you have in mind for that one?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So, recommendation 2 on incentives is all about removing financial barriers to adopting good practices. That's one of the most significant barriers to farmers changing practice in Canada. But the other most significant barrier is a lack of knowledge or awareness and kind of a lack of follow-up support so that farmers feel confident adopting, implementing, and keeping that new practice on their farm. What we know for sure from peer-reviewed literature is that farmers trust farmers. For a while, Paul, you know that we don't have a very strong or a very present public agrology service in Canada. And in many ways, this has been replaced with advisors who are often, also selling seeds or selling products for farmers. And therefore, the research tends to show that they do bias their information towards the sales of those products. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but what we're looking for is a balance of information. So there are many farmers across Canada that are already innovating with great practices and seeing really good success in terms of, building resilience, reducing emissions, but also having these practices make sense for their business, having it make economic sense. What we'd love to see is these farmers being able to mentor, to provide on-farm demonstrations and training to other farmers so that the good practices can scale from acre to acre to acre. And what we know, Paul, is there's great programs like this that exist in Canada already. So I'll just give a few examples. For instance, Young Agrarians work specifically with young and new entrants in the sector out in BC and the prairies, and most recently in the Yukon. And they offer farmer-to-farmer mentorship in ecological practices. And their program actually has, very strong results. Farmers who are mentored, on average, end up increasing their revenue after the year of mentorship by 50%. So there's something to say about, having guidance peer-to-peer that really supports good practice and also business culture. The list goes on, Paul, but what I'm trying to say here is that there are programs that already have the structures in place that are necessary to, support and reward farmers for mentorship, training, and demonstration, and to recruit new farmers to come see, what these farmers are up to and learn from them. But what we'd like to see, Paul, is that this be scaled up across Canada, because right now what we're seeing is there's great regional hubs, but it's not enough to get to all the farmers. So one of the investments we'd love to see as part of the recovery is investments in these kinds of programs to scale up so that more and more farmers can have access to information on climate resilient practices, and so that we can see these practices scale across hundreds of thousands of acres in Canada. Great.
So your next one is probably the most different than you might expect. The idea is to adapt business risk management programs to encourage risk-reducing practices. Can you talk about what you have in mind for that one?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This one's probably the most complex, so I'll just start with a bit of a background. So the Canadian business risk management programs are really critical income support programs for farmers. So farmers face lots of variability from season to season and within seasons, and sometimes, suffer major crop losses, not for anything that they've done, but because something happened, or maybe there's a change in a market. So these are public programs that help to support farmer livelihoods in bad years, simply put. Currently, the way the programs are designed is that they are not associated with practices that help to reduce risk or build resilience. We can understand then that in a climate changing world where we're seeing firsthand increased impacts from climate change because of severe weather events like storms and droughts, floods. Here in Quebec, we had the worst drought and flood on record ever in the history of Quebec, which had significant impacts on farmers here and led to lots of crop insurance claims. We saw hailstorms out in Alberta in June, again, leading to lots of crop insurance claims. The list, BC was way too wet, same kind of story. These aren't flukes, Paul. These are trends. We know the climate science shows that these kinds of climate-related weather events are getting worse in Canada. What we like to think about then is creative ways to still offer these programs to all farmers, just as usual, but to think about how we can add bonus structures to these programs so that farmers who are practicing and adopting at an increased scale practices that reduce risk or build resilience, that they could have a bonus applied to their program. So I'll give you a real example here, Paul. One of the things that we're thinking a lot about is crop insurance discounts. And this is not a new idea. PEI has a very long track record of offering crop insurance discounts that are tied to the adoption of certain environmental practices. These crop insurance discounts, in one-on-one conversations with farmers in PEI, I've learned are very, very popular. Farmers tend to like these crop insurance discounts. Again, out of Iowa, they offer $5 crop insurance discounts per acre on acres that are newly planted with cover cropping. Cover cropping is a great example, Paul, of a practice that not only reduces emissions, but also builds soil health, which increases resilience to these kinds of water impacts that we're going to see more and more in Canada. I'll give you one more example, Paul. There's another risk management program called AgriInvest, and it's farmers who are listening will know this program well. It's a matching fund. So, farmers are allowed to invest in this fund up to 1% of their eligible net sales, up to $10,000 per year. That's the cap, and the government will match that. The idea of this program is that this is the government's way of helping farmers out on a bad year. But again, what does that mean in a context of risk increasing on our farms? So the creative idea we've been thinking about is, what if we offered a different kind of bonus structure where instead of, a farmer who adopted a practice that helped to reduce emissions and build resilience, therefore, contributing to Canada's climate solutions, what if they were entitled to 2% matching funds up to $20,000 a year? Maybe it was 3% up to $30,000 a year. There's going to be a sweet spot there where we need to figure out, what does it cost the farmer to adopt these kinds of practices, and what's cost effective for the government? But I think these are the kinds of creative ideas, Paul, where we'll see widespread change in agriculture because these programs are so heavily subscribed. So AgriInvest as an example, it's about 80% of Canadian producers that subscribe to AgriInvest. So not all of them would sign up for the bonus structure, but there could be big potential here if we got that bonus structure right to incentivize transition to climate-friendly practice.
To do things. So your last recommendation is about supporting young and new farmers and a variety of measures to do that. So can you kind of briefly summarize some of the ideas that you have there?
Yeah, great, Paul. Thank you. So this last recommendation, again, we're thinking about recovery from COVID-19. And what we realized during the pandemic is that there were significant shortages in labor and lots of concerns around temporary foreign workers coming to Canada. And this recent impact is actually overlaid on top of a more foundational issue, which is a demographic issue in our sector, right? So the average age of the Canadian farmer is 55 years old, which means that many will retire out within the next decade. Most don't have a succession plan. I believe it's less than 10% of those farmers have a succession plan, Paul. And what we're seeing is growing rates of younger and new people coming into the ag sector. But what we know is that there's significant and bigger barriers for these people to get in. So there's, significant capital barriers, there's significant educational barriers because many of these people aren't coming from a farm background, but are hoping to get into the sector because in many cases, they are doing it not just to, join in on food production, but they see it as an opportunity to steward land, to, support Canada in its environmental performance. So what we're looking for with this recommendation is really the investment in young and new farmers to help them overcome these startup barriers as new business owners. There's lots of kind of different ways in which we can do this, but one of the things I want to flag is kind of a basic one. So many of our cost shared programs, Paul, that are offered to farmers and ranchers across Canada require that farmers match the funding. So it's often 50-50, but it depends, where the farmer then needs to put up the capital to be able to have access to that business. So what if we thought about a different kind of cost share program where maybe young and new entrants were entitled to claim their labor or their land as part of the capital that they were using to match the cost share program? Or what if we simply increased the contribution from the government and decreased the contribution from the young and new farmer? So these are just small ways in which young and new farmers may be able to overcome those big challenges that we see them facing in the first, 1 to 5 years.
Agriculture.
Yeah.
So why don't we switch now to probably the most exciting part? I mean, all the recommendations are interesting and have great potential. But the best part, probably the most exciting from your, and I know you spent a lot of time on this, is that the federal government has responded to your proposals with that short phrase in the throne speech that gives you hope for actual implementation of some of them.
Thanks, Paul. So we launched this report the day after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament. So when Prime Minister Trudeau prorogued Parliament, he announced that he was going to spend the next 30 or so days, the next month, reflecting on what Canada needs to build back better. So what are the key components of an economic recovery that will not just reestablish the economy in Canada, but that will create a newer, more sustainable life for Canadians in our economy? So, on day one of his reflection, farmers and ranchers were ready with solution. We're ready with 5 priorities. And so we met with Minister Bibeau of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We met with Minister Wilkinson of Environment and Climate Change Canada. We met with Minister Guilbeault of Heritage Canada. Minister Guilbeault is one of the ministers nominated to be part of the to think through the green recovery in Canada. And we also met with Minister McKenna's office. That's the Office of Infrastructure Canada. We met with several civil servants as well, particularly in the Environment Policy Division at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And overall, Paul, there was a lot of enthusiasm for these recommendations. And I think it's truly because they're farmer and rancher led. These are solutions that can be implemented on farms. They're tried and trusted already on some of our Canadian farms and ranches, and they're being delivered by real Canadian farmers and ranchers who are benefiting from these kinds of practices. So our recommendations really were kind of received with a lot of enthusiasm. And I won't give you all the details, but one of my favorite moments from these meetings was when Minister Bibeau, she had one request for us, and it was the following. She requested that we be even bolder and even louder, because all Canadians and all farmers and ranchers need to hear about climate impacts like floods and droughts are hitting farmers harder and harder. Year after year, we're seeing more extreme storms, more of them, and it's harder to make a livelihood on the land. And speaking of livelihoods, farm debt is at record levels. Our recommendations were heard, and we followed up with this report, Paul, with a letter writing campaign. So, Farmers for Climate Solutions itself wrote into Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We wrote to all of those ministers we met with. And then also all of our farmer member organizations also did the same thing, and several farmers and ranchers too. And we, our central request was that what we want in the new agenda is support for farmers and ranchers to reduce emissions and build resilience. And as you mentioned, that exact wording was included in the speech from the throne. Now, the speech from the throne presents a new agenda. It's mostly visionary, and the hard work is really the implementation. But what we're encouraged by, Paul, is kind of the next step. So what we've done is pull together a task force of 10 experts that are led by 2 farmers. So we have a Saskatchewan farmer, grain and livestock mixed production at a large scale, and we have a smaller scale vegetable producer producing for local markets out in BC. Those 2 farmers are leading a task force of 10 other experts who are scientists, who are experts in government relations, experts in renewable energy, in GHG quantification, and together we're working to further substantiate these recommendations, these kinds of policies. What we're most encouraged by, Paul, is that Minister Bibeau's office themselves called me right after the speech from the throne and said that they heard us on our wording, that they believe this is the change that we need to see in our sector, and that they're ready to collaborate towards finding the right kinds of solutions and implementing on this promise. Yeah, if only we all had crystal balls. I think Environment and Climate Change Canada is working very hard towards the next climate plan. Thrilled to hear that we're going to exceed our previous commitment, because we need to acknowledge the fact that our current climate plan isn't going to get Canada towards meeting its commitment to Paris Agreement in 2030. So something needs to change, and something needs to change quickly. Minister Wilkinson and his team at Environment and Climate Change Canada were hoping to produce a plan before COP26, which was going to be hosted, recently, but got postponed as a result of the global public health pandemic. And it's postponed to later next year. So all I can say, Paul, is that we can expect this climate plan for the next COP26. I can't speak any more precisely on how soon we'll see it.
Michelle, Karen, and thanks so much for sharing your insights and for all your hard work in lobbying and building this effort for the future. Thanks very much. And
thanks, Paul.
So this is Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast throughout the world, wherever you can access it. And if you have any thoughts on the program, please post on our social media feeds, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. So thanks to the listening audience, and tune in again next time for the next show.